First one we're gonna do. Actually, we're gonna honestly the first one we'll do is the classes because it's the least. It has the least in it. So let's move myself over here. There we go. Okay. Okay, so this is the whole thing, basically. We got a little bit. Ranger, D. I'm just going to put that there because I hate the Ranger class. It's terrible and it's awful. Same with Monk. It's also in the D. Better than Ranger, but not as good. Let me think now. These two are... For Ranger, it's just... Ranger is just a bad fighter and a bad wizard. And it makes me sad because Ranger is pretty good. Like Ranger, when you think about it, is like almost like an iconic class with D&D, especially for Dungeons and Dragons, but like fantasy in general. The Ranger, like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, just to name one slightly popular version of the Ranger. But in D&D, especially 5th edition, the Ranger is just bad. It's even without all the extra stuff they had to add to the Ranger, even if you're just thinking, even with all the crazy stuff they have added to try to make it better, it's just bad. Mostly, in my opinion, the reason is because the magic the Ranger gets isn't worth the sacrifices they have to make to be able to cast that magic. It's just bad. Like, I've enjoyed playing Ranger, but there are better classes for it. It does. And I mean, that's the sad part, Aegis. The sad part about Ranger is that it's a very fun class. Not only is it very thematic, there's like, the idea of a Ranger is amazing, but it's overall is just a bad fighter and a bad wizard. Because it's not really good at anything. You know? With the new stuff, with all like Tasha's Cauldron of everything, and you know, they added a bunch of stuff for the Ranger to make some of it better, but it's still just making it better than what it was. But you know, I think you'd fit most as the Artificer. Knowing you, Grism, I think, yeah, I would agree. For Monk, the problem with Monk is that Monk suffers from this is all talking about 5th edition, by the way. The other editions I don't know for 5th edition, but this is all 5th edition. For 5th edition, the reason Monk is D is because Monk is really good at chip damage and like death by 1,000 cuts, which is not inherently bad, but the best in 5th edition, when you have a big scary enemy, as a player, the best thing to do as a player is to never find out what that big scary enemy can do and kill it as fast as possible. The best possible thing for a player to do is to dump damage and be like, okay, this big scary thing, I never want to find out what it has to do and kill it in one turn. The Monk can never do that. Like, the other classes have some way to just dump damage. The Monk doesn't. It just punches. You punch it and maybe you stun it sometimes. But like, you never have that like, oh gosh, I need a lot of damage. Let me just do a ton of damage. It just never happens. All right, Major. Which is one of the reasons why it's D. Once again, really sucks because I think I personally like the Monk the most out of all the classes in terms of theme. I love the whole Monk, like just like the Monk archetype of like, I don't need weapons, I'm just gonna walk up and punch you, but it sucks and it makes me sad because it sucks. Now let's see. Okay, from the worst, let's go to the best. The best class in D&D. I mean, there are two classes that I think that can possibly be the best. Well, see, it's hard to say about the best because it really depends. But I think the two that I think about right away when I think of the best classes in D&D are Wizard and Fighter. And I think Wizard is the best, honestly. I think Wizard's the best because they're just the most versatile. And especially with all the new subclasses they got, or I don't know what they're called. Schools, I think they're called. Because, like, high-level magic, and just magic in general in 5th edition is so crazy strong that it's hard to say that Wizard isn't the most versatile and can do the most damage. Like, it can even, like some wizards, I think you can even be like a decent healer as well if you really wanted to as a wizard, which is dumb, but you know, you can do it, and it's not as good as like a cleric or even like a bard or a druid, but you still could do it somehow. So, you know, I think it's just so versatile in just so many ways. And then I think Fighter will be A. And the only reason Fighter isn't S is because fighters don't gain access to high-level magic. Because obviously they're a fighter. And even things like Eldritch Knight, you never get crazy magic. But the fighter with Axe and Surge, which you get at level 2, is just so strong. Being able to attack twice, or being able to do 2 actions, so in total attacking 8 times at level 20, I think. Because you have extra attack 3 times, so you attack 4 times, and then you action surge and attack 4 more times. It's just so strong. But the only reason it's not S tier is because that's, you know, you can never cast like crazy level 6 plus magic. Which, you know, is a downside of being a fighter, but, you know, I still think is good. Along with A tier, I think the Rogue is also here in A tier. Because of... This one depends on how, as a player, how nice the game master is. Because if they're really stingy with how to gain advantage and stuff like that to be able to proc sneak attack, which most of the time you need to be able to do to proc sneak attack, assuming they like if flanking is being used, or when you're surrounding or when you're flanking enemy. I don't know how to describe flanking without using the word flanking. When you have an ally opposing the enemy in front of you, that's very difficult. That's very difficult to explain when you don't have a grid in front of you. Anyway, it's relatively difficult to gain advantage if they're being stingy. But if not, and you can proc sneak attack very easy, Rogue does so much damage in one turn, almost as much damage as the fighter. But they also have the benefits of being ranged, melee, and to be fair, fighters can just use bows and stuff like that, and like with the feats sharpshooter or great weapon master. But Rogue also has the benefit of being like one of the bigger utility, like you just utility gods of D&D, of just being able, every skill, they're just so good outside of combat as well, with having like basically everything. So, you know, they can do massive damage, almost comparable to a fighter, but then outside of a battle, they can like break through 40 locks, go through entire sections sneaking, never being seen. Like if you're being a thief, just pickpocket literally everything. Then just take everything that isn't nailed down. Yeah, and yeah. then I'm also going to put Cleric in the A tier as well. Because one, they are the best healer in the game, period. There are other classes that can heal, like Bard and Druid aren't bad healers. They can heal and they're pretty good. Welcome back, Major. Paladins can heal, but they're not very good, honestly. There are ways to get healing as Sorcerer and Wizard, I'm pretty sure. But they are still, like, Clerics are just hands down the best healers. And, honestly, people forget about how much damage and utility a Cleric has as well, outside of the healing. Like, Spiritual Weapon that the Cleric gets is insane. I think it's one of the best spells in the game, at least top 3. And some of the subclasses are insane as well. Like, Life Cleric is just, like, so much healing. But yeah, so that's why I think Cleric is A, because one, they're the best healer, obviously. But they also do surprising amounts of damage, and with the magic for Clerics is just, it's just really good. Like, you're not going to be doing as much damage as like a Wizard with magic, but it's very comparable in my opinion. Okay, I'm going to put Barbarian, I think, in low A tier as well. No, Barbarian's in B tier. Barbarian's in B tier because they're quite limited of what they can do. And they're not as versatile as someone like a fighter or a rogue. Like, Barbarian is kind of locked into the I'm a big, scary person with no shirt or no clothes, I'm going to run in and fight them. I like all the more support-focused ones. I mean, my top 3 are Wizard, Fighter, Rogue, which aren't necessarily support. But I mean, one of the cool things about D&D is that I would argue that there is no, like, every class does have a way to do it, you know, to either support, deal damage, or tank in some way. There are better ones than others, but, like, you know, you can kind of fit every role with every class. Yeah, but the thing with Barbarian is that it is, from what I know, it is one of the more restricted classes of what you can do reasonably. Like, I'm sure you could do other things. I'm sure you could figure it out. But if it's, like, good, is different. I think the same goes for Paladin, in my opinion. Paladin, in my opinion, is actually even more railroaded into what to do because Divine Smite is so good. And you're kind of like, you don't want to cast magic because you want to use Divine Smite instead of casting magic. It's one of those weird things where it's kind of cool mechanic for the Paladin to be able to use their spell slots for something else. But it also means that you don't want to use your spell slots because it could be another Divine Smite. Which is a very difficult thing because it's also a really cool, unique mechanic. But it's not... It kind of also limits you in some ways, which is weird. And which kind of sucks. But it's also, that's like one of the things, like, how greedy do you want to be? And the answer is very greedy. For me. specifically. It also is one of those it's one of the classes that depend on many attributes, because you want high strength, you want high constitution, you want high charisma, because that's what your magic is based off of. You just, if you need more than 2 attributes to be good, it's very difficult to have a good character without either rolling for stats and just having god stats, or like just making deals with your GM. It's like, look man, please, I need a +2 in at least 3 things. Which can be annoying on both sides. I'm gonna be honest, I actually don't know a lot about the Artificer. I haven't read a lot about it. I'm gonna put it in B tier because of what I've seen and heard of the Artificer. It's pretty good, but just not as good as like a wizard's or any of the magic stuff, because it's not a full caster, but like it's not bad. But the problem is I don't know a lot about it, I'll admit it. So I'm going to put it on B tier and give it the benefit of doubt of what people have said. I'm going to put Warlock at C tier. And the reason I'm putting Warlock at C tier is because if you don't like Eldritch Blast, you shouldn't play Warlock. Because Warlock's Eldritch Blast, and then the Eldritch Blast, and then you Eldritch Blast. So if you enjoy Eldritch Blasting, it's a great class. But if you don't enjoy Eldritch Blasting, then you should probably play Wizard. But other than that, I think there are some really cool spells for Warlock and stuff, but you know, it's just one of those things where it is quite limited for the Warlock mechanics of like only ever having, like, you're only going to have 4 spell slots, so you can only ever cast 4 spells. And while you do regain spell slots on short rests, unfortunately the rest mechanic in 5th edition, short rests aren't utilized well enough, and that's not necessarily, that's not Wizards of the Coast's fault. That's Dungeon Masters and Game Masters' fault. But that's also like one of the things where, like, I think in my opinion there needs to be more reasons to short rest. And unless you're playing the Warlock class, there isn't really. Max, no. Look, do you see where I put, look at where I put the Warlock. It's where it belongs. It's where it belongs. It's wrong. We'll agree to disagree, Max. We'll agree to disagree. Bard, in my opinion, is also C tier. Because Bard is the jack of all trades class a lot of the time. There are ways to specialize in Bard. So Bard is one of those things where sometimes Bard, in my opinion, is A tier, right? Depending on what you're doing. But some of the Bard stuff is just like, you're just going to be okay at everything, and just, so that means you're not amazing at everything. You never do characters that rely on charisma because I can't RP, being charismatic. Understandable, Major, understandable. It's a common theme as well for a lot of people. But yeah, so the thing with Bard is like they're either A tier or they're C tier. And unfortunately, more often than not, they're C tier because being good at everything isn't actually good in 5th edition. In 5th edition, being amazing at 1 or 2 things is much better than being good at 4 or 5 things. You know? Like, being the jack of all trades isn't actually beneficial in many ways in 5th edition, but being amazing at 1 or 2 things is the best way to play for character build specifically, in like a blanket statement. They're great at everything but doing a lot of damage. There are ways to make bards do a lot of damage, which is when they hover around the A and B tier. But the problem is that in order for that to happen, you have to know. There's a lot of things you have to do in order to do that, you know? You can't just be like, hey, let me slap a bard together. And, like, let me slap a damage bard. You know? You have to, like, know what you're doing. Which, you know, I don't think is... You can't assume. You know? You can't assume everyone's going to know exactly what they want all the time. Because, in my opinion, a good character is also... There's also some improvisation. Not everything is planned. You know, there are very min-maxed building, like, min-maxed builds, you know, where everything is planned to the teeth, to the every single level up. But, you know, most players aren't like that. So the way I'm thinking about this tier list is, you know, the average player, what will they make, you know? Because, like, let me put it this way. If I thought about every min-maxed build, pretty much everyone would be S. The lowest would be B, because every class has a very min-max build that is pretty good, you know? So everything would just be at least B if you think about the min-max, like all the nerds pushing up their glasses. Jake the Meh 72, thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. Sorcerer is also C tier. I think it's worse than the Bard in my opinion. Min-maxing is no fun. I mean, min-maxing can be fun in certain scenarios. In my opinion, min-maxing can be fun. It's just that the people who min-max have a bad reputation. Very, very deserved in many ways. Because they're kind of like, it's like the anti-fun people. But like, and like the push-up glasses, actually people. But just because having a crazy good character doesn't necessarily, it's not fun. Thank you. Thank you for the birthday wishes. I appreciate it, Jake. And thank you for the follow. And Druid, I think, is top tier C. Because they're pretty good at Druid stuff. Like, becoming a bear is pretty cool, you know? But you're not going to be as blasty as, like, a wizard. Oh, sorry, I didn't explain why Sorcerer was C tier. My bad. Sorcerer is C tier because the spell limit is really difficult to get through. Thank you for the follow, Agent JFM. I appreciate it. Sorcerer is really... They are very limited on what spells you can take. So, like, it's very limited of what you can and can't do. There is also, for players who is charisma-based, so it's a very difficult thing to do for Sorcerer because it's charisma-based, so there's a lot of expectations of speaking, which, you know, can be potentially bad. Or uncomfortable, depending on who you are. But for purposes of, like, just builds, you're limited to what you do because of the spell list of the Sorcerer. And it's just not nearly as versatile as Wizard, Cleric, or Bard. Artificer and Warlock are just as limited in different ways. But in my opinion, Artificer, you're not necessarily dependent on your magic. You know, that's not necessarily a big deal, not being able to cast crazy amounts of spells. For Sorcerer, it is a pretty big deal. It's not the list of spells known. Sorry, that's what I meant. It's spells known. And Warlock, while you are technically more limited in terms of spells for Warlock, Eldritch Blast as a cantrip is much better than the Sorcerer cantrips because you can just do crazy amounts of things with Eldritch Blast. So your cantrips are better as Warlock. So honestly, Warlock and Sorcerer could swap places depending on how you want to play, like as a limited spellcaster. Because Sorcerer has more spell slots to play with, and they have sorcery points. But you're still limited compared to how many spells you know, and you don't have nearly as much choice as a wizard or a cleric. But as Warlock, your cantrip, your Eldritch Blast just gets crazy powerful. You can push a dragon 10 feet with Eldritch Blast. You can't do that as a sorcerer, unless you somehow learn Eldritch Blast. And for Druid, I think is a very fun class, but they have the problem is being a Druid is fun until you realize that Druids have all these random rules for building characters, like not wanting to wear metal for some reason, but being okay with wearing leather, which is technically animal skin. So I mean, sure, I guess it's kind of weird, but sure. So you're limited to types of things you can wear and use, which is an odd limitation for Druids. Makes sense thematically, but doesn't make sense in other ways because you can still use metal weapons half the time. So like they didn't, in my opinion, you either go all the way or don't go all at all. Like either do the whole, you are in fact a hippie and you will only use things from nature, or you can be if you want to. Make it like an optional rule of like, oh, by the way, if you want to be like a true nature person, you can have these self-imposed limitations on you. But like for instance, in the regular player's handbook, you can't wear metal armor, sure, but you can use a mace. Most maces are made out of metal and have metal handles. Like it makes no sense. Javelins have metal in it. Think like most of these weapons have metal in it or are mostly metal, which makes odd. It's a very odd. I get what they're going for, but in my opinion, they didn't go far enough. Like, if you're gonna do that, go all the way, or don't go at all, or make it an optional rule. Because optional rules can be a little more flexible. Because in optional rules, you can just list out a ton of things, and then if people want to ignore it, they can just ignore it. All right, that is the classes. Let me take a screenshot of this. Okay. D&D 5e class tier list. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty decent tier list. Like on the obviously they're like this really just depends